we've talked about C-11 before, but still not everybody's necessarily familiar with it. What is C-11 and what's it all about here?
So Bill C-11, in reality, it's all about government power. It's about the Trudeau government wanting more power for themselves and for bureaucrats. So according to the government, they're trying to pass Bill C-11 to make sure that people see more Canadian content and make sure that Canadian content providers succeed in the world. What our report shows is that Canadian content is thriving like never before. We had $6 billion of foreign investment in Canadian film and television in 2020, and that's during the pandemic. So number one, when they're saying that we need this bill to try to get Canadian content to do better, well, it's doing really, really well. And then what's the other side of the coin? The other side of the coin is that the government will be controlling through the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Television Communications. The government will be controlling what you can say, see, and share online. That's the basic conclusion of the report. And the reason for that is that the government's trying to create this new structure run by the CRTC where they could prioritize what you do or don't see in your media feeds, in your social media feeds, in your streaming feeds. They say what they're going to do is promote Canadian content and therefore demote non-Canadian content, but they're the ones who are going to decide what counts as Canadian content. And we also have no guarantee that once you create this mechanism now for prioritizing some content over other for CanCon, that you're not going to use it for some other purpose later, like whether or not you support the Trudeau government.
Well, yeah, it gives a whole lot of arbitrary power to some regulatory bodies on what's appropriate and what's not. And this is a government that just seems fixated on controlling information, though. I mean, it does seem like CanCon's more a premise. It's just a matter of wanting to get in and use that as an excuse to control.
The CanCon thing is a complete excuse. We show in the report that Canadian content is doing better than ever before. Netflix has invested hundreds of millions of dollars. It's very easy to find Canadian content online. And as I said, we had a record $6 billion of foreign investment. So I think that needs to be taken off the table. The government's rationale for doing this is completely flawed. And then once you figure that out, then you have to dig into, well, what's actually in the bill and what are they really trying to do?
Yeah, and you did that, with, as you said, with input from Michael Geist. I had him on the show before, and he talked about, some of the things. Well, what is CanCon and what isn't? I mean, is it CanCon if it was produced, here in the country and shot here, but it's actually, the set is an American one, so it doesn't look Canadian, or does it have to have Canadian elements in it, or does it have to employ a certain degree of Canadian people? Like it's a very nebulous world when you start talking about what may or may not qualify as CanCon.
Well, that's exactly right. And one thing that I mentioned in the report, for example, is that there is a biopic on Donald Trump called Gotta Love Trump. According to the CRTC, that counts as Canadian content because of some of the people who worked on that film. Whereas The Handmaid's Tale, which is based on Margaret Atwood's famous book, a very famous Canadian author, it's not considered Canadian content because it doesn't have producers that are from Canada, they're from elsewhere. So it shows you already that the CRTC is very bad at trying to figure out what Canadian content is and what it isn't. And if they're already bad at this now, why are we going to give them 10 times the amount of power to be bad at this at a much bigger scale? So that's a huge concern.
Well, and I imagine that the CRTC, the people who are going to be managing that, running that, I mean, they're people who are appointed by the federal government. So the ability for those people to be politicized can be high. It's not to say they necessarily are right now, but you never know.
Absolutely. So you are giving these bureaucrats at the CRTC literally the power to decide what we see in our news feeds and in our streaming feeds online. They say it's just going to be for Canadian content. And, for example, say we're going to take them at their word. That's what they're planning to do right now. Well, a year or two from now, they might decide, we've heard Minister Mendicino, who's been under fire for various reasons. He's suggested, for example, that in the future, the government might have to look into how to promote social cohesion, is his words. If the government's going to try to go after social cohesion a couple of years from now, well, is that going to be another reason or rationale to instruct the CRTC to filter what we see because of that? So that's the big concern, is down the road, this could be used for literally any purpose the government wants. These bureaucrats are appointed directly by the government, and the government gives them instructions about what to do. And the final thing that I'll add is that the minister actually hasn't even told us what the instructions are that he's going to give to the CRTC. He says he wants Parliament to pass the bill, the Governor General to sign it into law, and then he's going to figure out exactly what he wants them to do. You know, that's like signing on to buy a used car before you even do the test drive.
So he wants to give them all of the powers, but he won't tell us exactly what the mandate and what those powers will entail.
That's exactly right. There's no articulation of the mandate, and Dr. Geis has pointed this out as well. It's a very slippery slope when you give bureaucrats all of this power and literally don't even outline what you want to have done with all these powers.
And yeah, then these things have a chilling effect. I mean, again, it's hard on independent media, things like that. Our organization, we know we're opinionated and loudmouths. We're not going to back off on the government, but we could pay a terrible price, and suddenly they could find an excuse. Oh, you guys have infringed on this or that, and we're going to pressure providers to deplatform you because you didn't fall within the CRTC regulations. It's a dangerous area to go, and a lot of independent outlets might think, you know what, we're just going to not shake the tree too much so we can avoid that happening.
That's exactly right. And the problem is that you have right now the government and the CRTC able to define what they believe Canadian content is. And as we said before, their definition of what's Canadian content is very flawed. But one of the questions that will come up, of course, is what counts as un-Canadian content. If you are advocating for Western separatism or Quebec separatism, does that count as Canadian content? If it's somehow un-Canadian to suggest that, you know, you don't want to see the country stay together, is that going to fall under content that we shouldn't be promoting? So it's a very slippery slope between Canadian content for the sake of what's actually in it and Canadian content for the sake of what government bureaucrats think should count as Canadian content. That's the huge concern.
Yeah, and they use buzzwords that get disturbing, or loaded words like social cohesion. I mean, there's a lot of things you could say too. Well, you know, Corey rants too much at the start of his show and he angers people, and he's shot at Quebec a couple of times. That's interfering with Canada's social cohesion. Thus, his show should be have the plug pulled.
Yeah, I mean, social cohesion is like a very broad and dangerous word, a couple words. That's something you expect to hear in communist China. I mean, that's not something you expect to hear in Canada. A minister saying we might have to figure out some government regulations to promote social cohesion. That's literally what they're saying in countries like China and North Korea. And I should add that Twitter, when they were consulted on some of the government's planned bills, when they testified, they suggested that some of the government's plans are akin to what they're doing in China and North Korea. And to regulate user-generated content, which they're proposing to do and we can talk about, through broadcast regulations, they've said, Dr. Geis says it's unprecedented. It's not done in any other democratic country. And also, this is something that is done in non-democratic countries like China and North Korea.
Well, that's some scary stuff. Hopefully, I don't know, we can keep shining a light on it. I mean, the minister's pretty embattled right now. The government might want to kind of move him along and back off on some things anyways. We'll see. But this hasn't been a government terribly inclined to give ground when they dig their heels in either. So all we can do is shine light on it and discuss it and hope that we can pressure them enough to move along. You guys are doing a good job at that. Are there, before I let you go, you know, where can people find more information about what you guys are doing and stuff on these subjects?
They can go to taxpayer.com. You can see our new report that's out on Bill C-11, which we did in concert with consultating with Dr. Geist. There's petitions there. There's all kind of news information there. But I should also add that people should be very concerned about the regulation of user-generated content. There's user-generated content is captured by this bill. The CRTC says so, and that means that your posts on YouTube or TikTok, they could be regulated by the government. So we're not just talking about Netflix. We're not just talking about big companies. The government's going to come after you for your content. That's the danger.
Yeah, and that is a big danger we've always got to be on. I mean, again, this government's appetite for control has really been distressing. Well, thanks for coming on and your report on that and you know, expanding on it for us today, Jay. I hope we can talk again sometime soon.
Thank you.